So now let's look at another example that was included in one of our slides. This is a very well put together question. It includes all aspects of what you really need to find when it comes to percent increase or what you can find. So okay, so let's read the question. So in 2009, first we'll highlight what we know. 18 millimeter cubic feet, or okay, we'll just take that as cubic feet. 18 cubic feet of gas was used to heat the building. 2010 gas usage estimates increase by 6. So forget the units, for example. For now, assuming that they are the same units, which they aren't, we'll just see what the questions talk about relative to the numbers themselves. So this year's gas consumption is what of last year's. So now, okay, look, so we want this year's, so year 2, for example, so 2010 is what relative to 2009. So like I said before, when you're doing percent increase, this, whatever you're comparing it to relative to something or your original, if you're comparing 2009 compared to 2010, then 2010 would be your denominator. So this year's gas consumption is what percent of last year's. So first let's find the percent increase. Percent increase is what? So we increase by 6, start out with 18 times 100%, punch that in your calculator, and you get 33.3%. So essentially we just solve B instead of A. So we just solve B. By what percent did this year's gas consumption increase over last year's? So increase by this much over last year. So relative to last year. If it was relative to this year, we would have 6 over and then whatever we're using this year. So now let's find out A. This year's gas consumption is what percent of last year. So first we have to find out, how much we're using this year. A very quick shortcut way of doing it is, since we know that there was a 33% increase compared to last year, then that would mean that this year we used 100% plus an extra 33%. So it would be 133% of last year's. And if you want to really a full series of steps on how to find this, so you just do this. Let's look at the question. So we know that last year we used 18, okay, and we increased by 33%. Let me just get rid of this. So you take 18 times 0.33. What do you get? 18 times 0.33. You get 5.94. So that's how much we increased relative to last year. So we know since we used 18 last year and we increased by this much, this year we must be using 23.94. Same units, cubic feet, liters, whatever it is, meters. That is how much we're using. Now, the question is not quite finished yet. By what percent did this year's gas consumption increase over last year's? So basically what we want to know is, so we want to find out this year's gas consumption is what percent of last year. So as soon as you see that last part, we're talking about relative to last year. So this year we're using 23.94 relative to last year. So punch that in your calculator. There you go. 133%. So doing both ways will work. And this way, this is kind of like the logical way of thinking about it. This is kind of the mathematical approach to it. So now let's solve for C. See, last year's gas consumption is how much lower than this year's by what percentage. So now we're comparing last year's relative to this year. Since it's relative to this year, you know that this year will be on the denominator. So you know that 2009 you use from the question above, um, 18. This year you use 23.94. It's kind of better way of writing 18. So last year's gas consumption is how much lower than this year's. So the difference between these two was, of course, 6. So it was 6 lower, 6 whatever units. Just make sure they're always the same units. So what percent? So what's the percent decrease? So here's what you have. So last year's gas consumption is how much lower than this year's by what percent? Take the 6, you divide it by then this year's. This is the keyword right here. And you know that this year, since we already found it, you're using 23.94 times 100%. So you get 25%. So if you're going to take one thing away from this, this whole example, it's always remember what they're asking you and the wording relative to what. So for example, question A, this year's gas consumption is what percent of last year's? Since it's relative to last year, that goes in the denominator. What percent did this year's gas consumption increase over last year? So compared to last year's. So last year's 2009. Last year's gas consumption is what lower than this year's? Then. So this is compared to 2010. And if you're gonna take away one thing, it's that I would say that's the most important part. And you can always check your answers by like what we did using different methods. Breaking, like for example, breaking 133% into 100% plus 33%. Play around with those numbers. Just get comfortable with the examples, and I doubt there'd be any more questions like this that would honestly trick you.